Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. More normal height. I'm delighted to be here and to be invited by this great intellectual and educational institution. I associate universities with critical thinking, and the need for critical thinking is my overriding message to you today. Barbara Tuchman, the well-known American popular historian, wrote somewhere that in the 14th century, I think it was, a group of French professors was charged with the task of explaining what had brought the plague to France and to Europe. And after much brooding, the learned gentlemen, there weren't any ladies among them in those days, concluded that the cause had been a particular constellation of the stars. Well, with avian flu around the corner, I think we are glad that our scientists and health institutions are working with more critical minds and with more knowledge. Yet, our public arena is full of unsubstantiated and exaggerated assertions. At Madison Avenue, I'm told that they consider that Lincoln's famous lines that you can fool some people all the time and all the people sometime but not all the people all the time is much too pessimistic. Now, in the hard sell of the political world, as in marketing, there are temptations to exaggerate. There was a figure in Swedish television a number of years ago, not a politician, but a teller of hunter stories, who said that I never lie. He asked him, do you lie? He said, no, I never lie, but I admit that when the reality is not enough, I add. In this way, however, he said, you only get a little more truth than there is in reality. Now, this is what we call hyping. Extrapolations, innuendos, suggestive interpretations designed to lead us by our noses. When the hyping gets too crude and comes from people who want to have our confidence in political life, we react against it. The British government suffered a good deal of loss of confidence for asserting in 2002 that Iraq could deploy weapons of mass destruction within 45 minutes. I've said sometime that you can lose confidence of people in less than 45 minutes. And the alleged contract between Iraq and Niger for the import of uranium oxide, yellow cake, that was dangled before the public and even before the US Congress, deservedly lost the US and the UK government a lot of public confidence when it was revealed before the Iraq War by Mohammed el-Baradei that it was a crude falsification. Once this document, which had been in the hands of the world's most sophisticated and accomplished intelligence agencies for months, was given to the IEA, it had taken the agency less than a day to understand that it was fake. Where was the critical thinking of the intelligence agencies? And where was the critical thinking of the governments, which should have asked themselves why Iraq would seek yellow cake when any capability of enrichment would be very, very far away? It is now generally recognized that the principal assertion on which the war in Iraq in 2003 was sold to the US public and the Congress and to the UK Parliament, and on which there was an attempt to sell it in the Security Council, the continued presence in Iraq of weapons of mass destruction, was false. I'm not asserting bad faith. I think one should have a lot of evidence before you assert bad faith. If there weren't bad faith, at least there was bad judgment. The fact that the UN inspectors had reported from some 700 inspections at some 500 sites that they had found no weapons of mass destruction, and that they expressed doubts about some of the evidence which was advanced, was ignored, and still seems to be ignored, judging by the debates which now rage about who was right and who was wrong in the US administration, and not pointing out that in fact the inspectors had come to conclusions that were fairly close to the truth. One might have expected that the experience of the collapse of the pre-Iraq assertions about weapons of mass destruction should lead to more caution and more critical thinking before new assertions are made about the existence or possible emergence of weapons of mass destruction programs and assertions what should be done about them. But I do not have the impression that that is the case. Being the chairman of a commission on weapons of mass destruction, I will not belittle the continued risks of these weapons, and it is the task of my commission to search for ways of meeting those risks. However, I think we should assess the risk with critical minds and with a view not to scare but to search for remedies that are realistic and proportionate to the risks. I suppose that one reason why we continue to see much hyping about weapons of mass destruction is that our public craves its daily dose of angst, and it will reward media and authorities with attention and with votes if they deliver grounds for angst. No sooner had David Kay and his Iraq survey group reached the conclusions that the allegations about the existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq were wrong, then he went on to say that there were nevertheless clear evidence of weapons programs. Yes, I think it was better before, actually. How about you? Yes, I think it's kept getting across better now. No, so David Kay said that, yes, I can't find any weapons. Well, he couldn't very well say the contrary, because then he would have been asked to produce them. But he said that clearly there were programs, and he had seen laboratories underground and other things. But then came Charles Delfer, and he reported that he could not find evidence of any programs, except in the known field of missile. But he went on to report that interrogations of Saddam's lieutenants suggested that Saddam would have had the intention of rebuilding weapons of mass destruction if and when the sanctions were lifted. Well. There was no intention to lift the sanctions at the time, and even less any intentions to lift the monitoring of it. Now, President Bush has been reported as saying that 9/11 was the Pearl Harbor of the Third World War. The Pearl Harbor of the Third World War. We are to understand, I think, that the U.S. is engaged in a world war against terrorism, that this war is now fortunately fought away from U.S. soil, and that the ultimate threat is terrorists using weapons of mass destruction. In a recently announced reconfiguration of offices in the State Department, this view of the world seems to be acted upon, resulting in a reduced emphasis on arms control agreements and an increased emphasis on WMDs, terrorism, the Proliferation Security Initiative, counter-proliferation, interdiction, and threat reduction. It was long ago, I understand, that there was any office devoted to ideas about disarmament. That is a pastime. Let me say straight away that I think programs on threat reduction, on better accounting of fissile material and other nuclear material, better locks on stores for such material and equipment, or better border controls and better control of the conversion of research reactors to the use low enriched uranium rather than high enriched uranium, are non-spectacular, prudent and desirable measures, whether we think of the risks of state or non-state actors, and I favor them. I think a speed up of the destruction of chemical weapons stocks, the control of export of many chemicals and measures to protect chemical installations against the risk of attack are similarly wise and prudent. And I think that we must have multi-pronged programs to reduce the risk that modern biological research and commercial activities raise. I'm all in favor of that. However, I don't think that these and other measures, notably increased cooperation between police and intelligence in different countries, amount to a third world war. Nor do I think that the vast counter-proliferation and anti-terrorism action that the Iraq war was supposed to be has helped to influence Libya, Iran, or DPRK, and certainly not helped to reduce terrorism. If anything, it seems to me that new fertile soil for terrorism has been created, where there was little before. There was a great gain in the toppling of Saddam, who was one of the most brutal dictators the world has seen. And I join in the hopes that the brutalized Iraqi people will succeed in coming together and avoid a fate like Yugoslavia. However, I fear that Saddam's removal, which I think must have brought most Iraqis a sense of relief, occurred through a counter-proliferation operation that was seen by the same people as humiliating. Now, what is counter-proliferation? Whether or not there are any soft parts in it, I'm sure that counter-proliferation may comprise the use of armed force. It is prevention rather than preemption. It can be anything apparently from assassination of nuclear scientists to the destruction of a research reactor, as in the case of Iraq, or the waging of the war 2003. I'm confident that, regrettably, any restraints existing in the UN Charter on the use of armed force, notably Article 51, are of no or marginal relevance to the doctrine of counterproliferation. All options, we are told, are on the table, and the idea of permission slips from the Security Council we have heard in the US presidential election is totally ridiculous. It is not, I think, any such restrictions that have held back counterproliferation armed attacks on nuclear installations in the DPRK. No restrictions in the UN Charter, I think, are actually functioning as restraints on attacks on the North Korea or Iran. Rather, I think these restraints, which have so far been heeded, have been due to an awareness of the undesirable consequence that would follow from such attacks. And I'm thinking of the fact that North Koreans have artillery that can reach Seoul, or the fact that the circumstances that probably 90% of the Iranian population would support the regime rather than 30 or 40 or whatever it may be now if Iran were attacked by the US by cruise missiles or some other way. It's evident that to a strong military power, the use of armed force is available as a matter of fact and may appear hopeful means of cutting Gordian knots. The question is rather the wisdom of such armed action if it's not taken in a situation in genuine self-defense, or if it is not taken with the authorization of the Security Council. Based on poor intelligence, as it was in the case of Iraq, and as it was in the case of the chemical factory outside Khartoum that I think the New York Times wrote about the other day, it can have very negative consequences. It has been suggested that the United States is like an impatient Mars, quick to use its strong military force to solve problems, while Europe is like a patient Venus, eschewing force and endlessly negotiating to solutions. Without denying the use of threat or use of force, that it may be indispensable sometimes, I confess my sympathies for Venus. The whole world, including the United States, would do well, I think, to become a little more feminist. Now let me touch on two other approaches to non-proliferation which may not raise grave risks, but which I think are oversold. I have in mind first the PSI, the Proliferation Security Initiative, the arrangement under which states participating may intercept ships and planes suspected of illegal transport of items relevant to weapons of mass destruction. Ambassador Bolton praised it as being an activity rather than what he contemptuously called a treaty-based bureaucracy. As far as is known, it has only been applied with results in one case, a German ship that was intercepted on the way to Libya with enrichment-related equipment. Nevertheless, it is hailed as a very major scheme, happily unrelated to any existing organization or treaty. In my assessment, its greatest importance may lie in the cooperation that it calls for between intelligence agencies in different countries. In substance, it appears to me chiefly as a useful means of enforcing export restrictions on weapons of mass destruction-related items. The other approach I want to comment upon relates to what is called the nuclear fuel cycle. It has been suggested that if nuclear power were to be expanded drastically to restrain the present reliance on CO2-producing hydrocarbons, there would be a need for many more enrichment plants to produce the low-enriched uranium fuel. More plants, it has been said, could pose a risk of a cascade of new nuclear weapon states, Some proposals have been made in the past few years seeking restrictions on the building of plants for the enrichment of uranium and the production of plutonium, fuel cycle activities. Several of these proposals would involve placing highly ambitious managerial functions on some international body. For instance, deciding whether a state was in good standing from the point of view of non-proliferation before granting a request to deliver low-enriched uranium fuel for power purposes. Fuel that now can be purchased on an international competitive market would thus become subject to an international decision, except for those states which had their own enrichment plants. It seems clear that these proposals have been triggered as much out of concerns for the case of reprocessing in North Korea and enrichment in Iran for the distant hypothetical risks of proliferation linked to more enrichment plant, more triggered by these cases of North Korea and Iran than by the fear of hypothetical risk in the future. However, it also seems clear that these general proposals will not be of any importance to influence either Iran or North Korea. They are much more likely to be in these countries, much more likely to be influenced by proposals to keep their specific neighborhoods, the Korean Peninsula and the Middle East, free from nuclear fuel activities. At the present time, the proposals appear to me for fuel cycle restrictions appear to me almost as distractions from the highly relevant and worrisome current questions, namely how to dissuade North Korea and Iran from fuel cycle activities. Further negotiations on these cases and efforts to move towards peace on the Korean Peninsula and in the Middle East are, in my view, more important than any search for further restrictions on enrichment activities. Accordingly, I look with some hope on the apparent increased determination of the US government to help settle the differences between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And I also think that the latest US proposals on the Korean affair have at long last moved the issue of security forward in a way that gives some hope. It may be less difficult to persuade the DPRK to stay away from a military nuclear program by promising that country will not be attacked than by threatening it with attack if it does not stop the program. I have no illusions that it will be easy in either way, but I think that threatening every month or so that all the options are on the table are less likely to bring concessions than if you say that if you stay away from the fuel cycle, we will promise a normalization of relations, as they've talked about, and also not any attacks either by conventional or by nuclear means. I further think that the negotiations with Iran, which does not seem to have contained any significant offers, like the offers in the Korean affair, should contain elements of that kind, rather than being accompanied by the traditional periodical statements that all options are on the table. Such threats may produce precisely the effects that they are intended to prevent. Perhaps you may think that I'm going far in my critical thinking on the current non-proliferation approaches, but let me assure that there are several approaches that I feel deserve much support, and on the verification field is one of them. The additional protocols strengthening IAEA safeguards still enjoys widespread support to become the modern standard of verification. And I think that is wise, and I'm glad, because I took the initiative to the negotiations, the talks in the IAEA, which eventually resulted in a consensus adoption of them in 1997, the last year that I was in the IAEA. And I think it seems to me that the US also remains positive to the IAEA safeguards in general and to the integrated safeguards in particular. It is clear that even with a much stronger teeth, these may be insufficient in a zone free from weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. You may have to go further than that, just as we've gone very much further than that in the case of Iraq. A hint that they may also be deemed insufficient in the case of North Korea came a few days ago. And the US negotiators suggested that the P5 states in the Security Council might have a role in the verification of a denuclearization of North Korea. Now, this is an intriguing idea, which reminds me that in the autumn of 2002, a US draft resolution on inspections in Iraq would have given the P5 a dominant influence over the inspection. This was a US draft for what eventually became Resolution 1441. I did not at the time think that it would be wise to submit international inspection to the guidance of 5 powers with possibly 5 different views. Either it is an international inspection or an inspection by some alliance. And if it is international, it should not be infiltrated or remote controlled by any individual state, as undoubtedly was the case with Iraq inspections in the 1990s. It will then lose its international legitimacy, as UNSCOM did in the end. If, as we may hope, the Security Council were to become generally more engaged in the issues of non-proliferation, of weapons of mass destruction, it might also be wise for the Council to transform the still existing UNMOVIC organization into a small technical advisory team unit. The IAEA and the OPCW, the Chemical Weapons Inspection Organization in The Hague, are of course available for inspections in their respective fields and could be asked to report more often to the Security Council. However, for in-house technical advice and for possible challenge inspections in the field of biology and missiles, a small unit with the accumulated experience of UNMOVIC and UNSCOM could be most useful. UNMOVIC still retains a roster of skilled staff that is being periodically trained, even at this time, and that staff that could be mobilized for inspections. And as I said, the staff is still the roster is kept up to date and still being well trained. Now, moving from inspection to the Resolution 1540 by the Security Council, it's, in my view, an intriguing innovation. Generally, the Security Council uses its power to adopt binding decisions under Chapter 7 of the Charter for concrete measures or actions, like sanctions. That resolution, however, is used to oblige member states to adopt internal legislation, to implement treaty obligations, and to set up a commission to monitor and promote implementation. In a world of very uneven effectiveness in state action to implement international obligations, for instance in the struggle against terrorism, the resolution, I think, should be welcomed. It also illustrates in a flash the power that exists within the United Nations to bring about measures throughout the whole world community of states. It is not only legitimacy that follows from such decisions supported by UN organs which represent the whole world community. By acting within the UN and in accordance with its rules, results can be obtained that limited alliances of the willing cannot attain. Cooperation in global institutions have potential benefits not available to such alliances. Some final comments. The UN Summit Declaration failed to contain even a sentence about disarmament and non-proliferation. To the US side, any mere mention of disarmament appears to have been unacceptable. To many others, references to further measures to prevent the spread of weapons of mass destruction were unacceptable unless, at the same time, measures were urged under which the nuclear weapon states and the world would accept restraints, not least to confirm the commitments they had made in 1995 to secure the consent of non-nuclear weapon states to an indefinite duration of the Non-proliferation Treaty. This deadlock that we have seen since last spring at the NPT Review Conference and which continued during the summit may last. Most serious, in my view, is that the US at the present is determined not to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. In all likelihood, a US ratification would trigger a Chinese, and a Chinese would trigger an Indian, and an Indian would trigger a Pakistani, and so on. On the other hand, the informal moratorium, which is currently observed, might be broken. In the US, there are groups which want to develop nuclear weapons with new missions to test. The freedom of action seems to be valued higher than the risk that the moratorium would break. The Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, which would stop the production of highly enriched uranium and plutonium for weapons, is still supported by the United States, but it rejects any verification, claiming that such verification would not be reliable. It is perfectly true that there will be uncertainties in the amounts of highly enriched uranium and plutonium that are produced in large installations, but inspections of installations are not the only way to obtain confidence about compliance. One is tempted to think that a reason for the newly developed objection against verification of that treaty might in reality be a wish to retain freedom and flexibility for the future. I shall conclude. In the area of arms control, the states of the world, to me, seem like a primitive community of the early Middle Ages, in which families and clans and tribes have their own arms and use them to maintain peace by deterrent and blood revenge. Not long ago, states also used their weapons to grab territory or to spread faith or one faith or another. By contrast, a fundamental feature of the state community, national state community, is that a monopoly has been secured on the possession and use of arms, apart from small caliber ones. In most cases, some chieftain or king achieved this result in the states by martial means. The monopoly on power and arms, the king's peace, came first. The rule of law controlling the king came later, and democracy came last. The question, I think, now is before the world, is whether the monopoly on the threat of use of arms in the international community will be brought about by Mars or by Venus. In Europe, Mars was at work from time immemorial, but the job was eventually done by Venus. I hope she will prevail also at the global level.